All right. Hello, everyone. How exciting to be able to do a Writers' Festival in person in this crazy pandemic times. So thanks to Catherine and the BAD team for inviting us along and to be part of it. Before I introduce our special guests here, there's a few housekeeping things I just need to quickly go through, so I might quickly whip through that first. So welcome to the Crime Festival. I'm Tim Ayliffe, and I'm really happy to welcome you all to the Metcalfe Auditorium. We acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation as the traditional owners of this land and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. First, a few housekeeping things that I mentioned. As you will have already seen, we are following COVID protocols. Social distancing means there are a restricted number in the room. Hand sanitizer is available at the door. Please try to respect the protocols yourselves and follow all the social distancing things that you're all doing already. Mute your mobile phones, and if you're going to take photos, that's okay, but just turn your flash off. And if you're a social media person, you can use the hashtag #BadCrimesSydney, BadCrimeSydney, or BadCrimesSydney is the handle as well. Now, I've got three former correspondents here that have all covered and spent a lot of time in the US, so I'm not going to ask them about the American election because I'm frankly sick of it, but at the end, during question time, you're most welcome to as well. So, on that note, I'm going to introduce them all. So, Caroline Overington is the best-selling author of 11 books, including the top 10 bestseller, The One That Got Away and Last Woman Hanged, which won the Davitt Award for True Crime Writing in 2015. She's won 2 Walkleys, and she's currently the associate editor of The Australian, and her most recent book is Missing William Tyrrell, which is a non-fiction book, and before that, The Ones You Trust, which is a crime thriller. Welcome, Caroline.
Thank you for having me.
Michael Brissenden is a colleague of mine at the ABC. He's worked there for about 30-odd years. He's done pretty much every senior on-air role you can think of, including hosting AM, reporting for Four Corners, which he currently does. He's been the political editor of 7:30, a foreign correspondent, and covered rounds like national security and defence. He's also got 2 Walkleys, and in 2017 he released his debut thriller, The List, and his next crime thriller, Dead Letters, it lands in February. Welcome, Michael. And you've probably never heard of Chris Hammer, so I'll have to spend a bit of time introducing him. But Chris has also was a journo for more than 30 years, covering federal politics, international affairs for publications like The Age and The Bulletin. He was a roving correspondent for Dateline, reporting from dozens of countries. He's written a critically acclaimed non-fiction book, The River, before turning his hand to crime writing with a book you've probably never heard of called Scrublands, that won a significant award last year, the Dagger, for new writing for a new writer. And his follow-up was Silver, and his latest is Trust, which has just come out. So welcome, Chris. Now, that's one of the longest introductions I think I've ever done, so we better get into it. So this session's about journos that turn to crime writing. So I'm going to start with you, Caroline. Covering gruesome crimes and the dark side of life in our day jobs isn't enough. Why?
You know what's interesting though? It's one thing to write about crime in fiction because you don't have to take account really of the victims. So when you're writing fiction, these are your fictional characters and you can kill them off, and it can be quite a joyful process, particularly if you've run into a problem with your book. You can just kill that character off and carry on with your story. It's much easier than writing about real-life victims and real-life crimes. I've had a go at doing both. So the most recent book is about William Tyrrell, who's the little boy in the Spider-Man suit who's missing. And you have to take extra special care because you're dealing with the fact that you have a biological family, his parents, and a foster family who he was living with when he went missing. And they are alive and they are living here in Sydney. And you have to be sure that you take proper care of their emotions. You have to take proper care of the facts. You have to be cautious in your descriptions of everything because the life of a small boy hangs in the balance. We don't know whether he is alive or dead. With fiction, I feel a much greater sense of freedom.
I'll jump over you, Michael, to Chris, because he's sitting out in the wings there, and just stop him taking photos of me. Why did you turn to crime?
Oh, I tried non-fiction. I really enjoyed it. Found out I loved writing. Found out I could write a book. Found out there's no money in writing books in Australia. Found out that I didn't have the time or money to write any more non-fiction. So I thought, I'll try I've always liked writing. Wasn't sure whether I had either the talent or the story to write, say, a literary book. I'd always liked reading crime fiction, so I thought I'd try my hand at writing it. There are other reasons, but pretty much it's as simple as that.
I left you to last on this one, Brisso, because at the launch of your book, The List, a few years ago, I remember you saying that with fiction you can get so much closer to the truth. So what did you mean by that?
Well, I think what I meant was that I just find this genre in particular gives us a real license to reflect what's going on culturally, socially, in our moment, or in any moment you're writing about. Like, I mean, for instance, if anyone's read Adrian Mackenzie's books on the Troubles, I think you learn more about the Troubles reading his fiction than you do going back reading history. So I think that's sort of what I'm getting at. I find that we have such license in this genre to reflect the sort of just the interesting moments that we're living through, and the cultural aspects of our life, the dialogue, what's going on at the time, the way people really speak to each other, the music people are listening to, all that sort of stuff. And I think there are also things that you can say in fiction in reflecting what's going on that you would never write in journalism, right? Like you just couldn't write it because, you'd be up for libel or whatever. But, these are fictional characters, fictional moments, fictional situations, but they're based in reality. And we're not writing fantasy, we're writing, we're writing from our lived experience in a way. That's why it is, as you said, Caroline, it's such a liberating experience, because you are writing your moment, but in a way that's so totally different from what we do, professionally, and sort of, looking at the facts and, being very aware of who we're writing about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to keep asking the questions here, but do jump in, guys, if there's something you want to add to. So that idea of getting closer to the truth, though, I think there's something quite liberating, isn't there, about, taking, your readers inside a room, whether, it's to do with national security, the cops. To be able to do that, you can really give, I think, readers a sense of what it's really like. And I guess our journalistic background makes us want to do that accurately. So do you find, even though you're writing fiction, is it really important for you to be able to, get that stuff right? So when someone's reading, Brissenden, Overington or, Hammer book, that they go, oh, this is, I know it's made up, but there's a lot of truth in this. Is that, let's start with you, Caroline, is that what you're trying to do?
Yes and no. I think that's very true of these two gentlemen's books. I read them and I know for sure they know exactly what they're talking about. Because I write both, I found, so let's say, for example, with the William Tyrrell book, you're doing it's a different calculation in your mind. The first thing I had to ask myself is, why are you writing this book? Because if the only reason you are writing this book is because you think it's a great story, get in the bin. Because this is not a great story. This is not entertainment. This is somebody's life you are talking about. Many people's lives you're talking about. So if all you're trying to do is entertain people, oh my goodness, here, look, a crime thriller, that in a way is disgraceful. That's not why you do it. You do it because you think this crime is solvable. This crime is something we should not give up on. We should not give up on this boy. We should look at the evidence again. We should go back, try to figure out what they did wrong the first time, see if anyone comes forward as a base. If you can do it, you have to have the right motivation in mind. Whereas with fiction, I feel very much like I don't have to have any responsibility to my reader. I can just have a whole lot more fun. I don't feel the weight that I felt with William Tyrrell, And therefore, I feel like it's not necessary to me that people might read it and think, well, that would never happen, because it's only meant to entertain you anyway.
So then, Chris, on that, reflecting on what Caroline said there, how important is it with your writing that you sort of seek to in some way reflect the world in which we live, and maybe it doesn't need to be about the crime, but maybe it's about something broader than that?
I think the last thing you want to do is be didactic. I'm not writing a fiction book to sort of convey or lecture to the reader. The second thing I think is, yes, you want a sense of authenticity. So the feeling that it's real, the feeling that it's possible, but that doesn't necessarily mean it has the same degree of accuracy that, say, journalism has. I mean, you can read books where the author has done incredible research, but you might get then as a 4-page description of an autopsy because they've sat in on an autopsy, but it doesn't help the story. It's like 4 pages. If you can capture that in one sentence, just the sense of it or the smell of it or something like that, that's going to carry you forward. But I think there is, getting back to what Michael said, if you're reflecting certain truths about society, that doesn't impede the book. It actually helps it. It helps reinforce it. I was just in a session just before with Gary Disher was to mention this, and he made the observation, something along the lines. I don't want to verbal him, but I think literary books are often about the personal. Crime books are set somewhere. The setting's important, the landscape, but also the societal parts of it. So if you read someone like Michael Connolly, he's often just touches very lightly on how inequitable and unfair the modern Los Angeles is, and that there are winners and there's losers, and in his books, the losers deserve justice just as much as the wealthy do. So in that crime book, you can touch on all those things, and it's really the impression of authenticity that's actually more important than authenticity itself.
Although there are times where someone will, get in touch and say, you got that wrong. So, sometimes the research is sort of necessary, And there's nothing worse. I mean, we'd be the same, watching a television series or something where they go into a newsroom and you go, that would never happen in a newsroom. And you really look at it, suddenly you're just not interested in it anymore. So you do have to get that right. I
did have this one thing in Scrublands that I saved by a perceptive editor. I had Martin Scarsden, the protagonist. He's in this little country police station, and he's just watched the ABC News, and he's got some fresh info. He walks out in the town, and I'd really like this scene, and it's night, and then the moon is blood red because there's bushfire smoke and there's moths fluttering around the thing, and the editor says, it's January. He's just watched the 7 o'clock news. The sun won't set for another hour. And I went, because understand, I'm not reporting on what happened. I'm just making it up. And, I just got the timing wrong. And the trouble with that is a whole lot of readers, it just would have gone clunk. And it would have broken that little spell, that impression that it is authentic. So it's not necessarily some little aspect of forensic science or something. It could be something as common as that. And, with my latest book, Trust, last time I lived in Sydney full time was in the 90s. So I was thinking, God, I've got to go back and walk all the way around Surrey Hills because I know it's changed. I better find out how it has changed.
We'll come back to this stuff a bit more later, but I wanted to go back to the sort of, the original premise around not just why journalists, turn to crime writing, but whether any of you when you decided you wanted to write fiction as well, because I knew for me it was when I was a kid. What other did it burn inside you really early on? And then, I guess another question is, if you weren't going to be a journalist, what would you have been, Caroline?
No, it didn't really burn inside me when I was a child. I always really wanted to be a journalist. I really desperately wanted to be a journalist when I was a kid, that's for sure. And then the idea of writing fiction came much later. I think the idea of writing fiction just appealed because when you're writing journalism all the time, it's quite short. The kind of journalism I do is quite short. Your maximum piece would be maybe 1,900 words or 2,000 words, which isn't very long. And fiction gives you an opportunity to write 80,000, 100,000, 120,000 words. And the challenge of doing something like that appealed to me.
So it wasn't just journalism that took your fancy early on?
No. Well, actually, I wanted to be a journalist when I was about 14, and my father talked me out of it for various reasons. And so I sort of wandered off into other things. Went to art school, played music, did a whole lot of other stuff. Wasted, quite a few years. And then realised...
Encourage your kids to do the same.
Yeah, and then realised I was hopeless at all of that, and I was never going to make any money, and I was never going to be able to live, so I better go back and do what I actually thought I could do, which was write. And luckily in those days, I, without any sort of degree or anything, managed to get a foot in the door and work my way through it, and that's... I'm very glad that I was able to do that and had that opportunity. I don't think you'd get that opportunity now, actually. I think it'd be a lot harder. So it's been great. But I also think that there's something about that journalism at the moment, I think, can be a bit sterile, and I think you need to have a lot of different sorts of people in it, to make it, to give it the sort of depth and authenticity almost, like if you just have economics graduates or law graduates or whatever going on to be journalists, it makes for pretty boring copy, I reckon. So yes, and as for writing fiction, I think I probably tried to write my first book when I was about 15, and
we need to see that.
It was not worth seeing. Then I tried again. I wrote a book when I was in my early 40s, and I sent it off to various people. And I remember I got this one. I got this one reply from an agent who came back and said, all she said was, that opening in chapter 14 was quite good.
Now the opening of the book.
So I gave up, and then I tried again, and actually it worked.
Yeah, so it sure did. Chris?
I think I like the idea of being a writer quite early on, much more than I liked actually doing the writing. I remember when I did do a journalism degree, and as I was finishing, I lived in this fantastic old house out in the bush. I thought, I could just sit here and write a book, and it was a great dream. The thing is, I just didn't have the attention span to write anything like a novel, which is why journalism, for me, initially was so suitable, because I had the attention span of a gnat, particularly doing, in my 20s, doing nightly television news. You turn up at work and you didn't know what you're going to do that day, and by the end you'd done a story or two, and it really suited my mentality. But then as the years went past working as a journalist, I really got over daily journalism to the point that I couldn't really bear it. And I was fortunate in that I could, working for Dateline and the Bulletin, I was able to do longer and longer forms of journalism and spend weeks and weeks on stories. Another luxury which is very rare in this day and age. And that's what then eventually led to writing the non-fiction books, where, as I said, I discovered, as opposed to liking the idea of being a writer, I actually liked writing, the process of it. So, yeah, early on I really had that idea to be nice to be a writer. It was just that I really admire there are some brilliant young writers in Australia, people who produce amazing books in their 20s. There's no way on earth I could have done it. I just didn't have the mindset to do that. And I think journalism helped me develop that mindset to stretch, it gave me some of the craft skills, but just stretched my horizons further and further till I arrived at a point where I actually could write a reasonable fiction book.
Yeah, I'm sure that's something that all of you probably feel. I mean, I've got a crappy book that I wrote in my 20s that's sitting in a drawer.
Oh, no, I tried. Yeah, I got a really crappy one, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, that's the thing, there's the thing that a lot of readers, maybe you do know, but a lot don't know, is that writers usually have 1, 2, 3 or 4 books that are sitting in a drawer that will never see the light of day. And although it can be a bit upsetting at the time, because it's funny, you spend maybe a year, 2 years, depending on how you're balancing your work life, writing a book, and then suddenly you're in a hurry to get it published, right? Then, now you have much more respect for that whole process. You don't want to get it published. You don't want anything to be published until it's absolutely, in its best form. It just shouldn't, you just don't want it to be out there. But yeah, on that thing with, readers knowing that for us, I think failure, you learn from your failures, and it makes you a much, much better writer. Yeah. Have you got any books in a drawer, Caroline?
No.
You haven't?
No.
Oh, off. Okay. So now back to the books themselves. Go back to you, Chris. Real life characters. I want to know, you've got such a, this is the third book with Scarsden. In Trust, it's a fantastic plot. I don't want to do any spoilers here. Someone dies, but that's a crime novel. Is there any? Where do you get your ideas?
I don't know, and I'm thinking I should take notes as I'm writing the books, because it's some I do know, but others don't. So in Scrublands, the opening scene, a priest shoots 5 members of his congregation dead. Where did that come from? Don't know. It's not based on any crime that I know of, not in Australia, not in the US even. It just came as a very compelling, I guess, sort of crime that people would want to then find out why it happened. Often when I'm writing, I am a bit of a pantser. So crime writers are often sort of split into these 2 categories: the ones who plot everything out and then start the narrative, and the ones who just kind of have a bit of an idea where the book's starting and where it might head, and they then just see what happens. And I'm definitely in that latter category. So I'll be writing and I think I know where the book's going, and then I'll get a better idea. Or there'll be a scene that's sort of necessary to take the plot further, and then I think, well, how am I going to make it more entertaining? And then it pops up, oh yeah, look, what if that happened? And it's the same with characters. They often start as almost like transactional plot points, and then they take on a life of their own. And where some of it comes from, I can put my finger on. Others, no idea.
But isn't that the refreshing thing about writing fiction, right? That you can
go. It's so liberating. Yes.
That's right. You can just go, oh, what if that happens? Yeah, what a great idea. Right? Do that.
The other great thing about writing fiction, particularly crime fiction as opposed to journalism, is you can resolve everything. You can tell the reader what happened, when it happened, why it happened, how it happened, all the rest of it. So often in journalism you can't do that because you just can't find out the answers, and sometimes even if you've got a good suspicion, you can't publish it anyway because of defamation or whatever. So, and Brisso's right, you can change the ending. I changed the ending 3 times in Scrublands and twice in Silver. So it's, that's the joy of it.
How about you?
I think Chris has hit on something really important there, because that was definitely true with Missing William Tyrrell. How do you write a book where you cannot tell the reader where he is? Because the one thing the reader wants to know is, what happened to William Tyrrell? How does the 3-year-old boy simply disappear? Why don't we know where he is? And if you can't answer that question in the book, then you need to be able to have some other compelling idea for the reader, particularly if your goal is to try to keep attention on the crime and perhaps one day see it solved. And so you have to find a different mindset somehow, and sort of say, well, here is the evidence. Here is where they went wrong. Here is what the police did in the first hours. Perhaps they could do it differently next time. Here is a character that perhaps they could interview again. Here is a string that they didn't pull on. Something like that, because you can't. As in fiction, I would be able to tell you in the end, here he is, and to not be able to give the reader that sense of satisfaction of being able to say, we know what happened to him, bring him home to his parents is very frustrating. For you as a reader and also for me, and I had to find a different way of doing it. I think that's very true.
You'd spent a lot of time as an investigative reporter on that story before writing that book. It must have been a tough book to write. It's not that it's a tough book to write for me, but I was in contact every day for 3 years. I mean, I know that sometimes people like to describe, I work for The Australian, it's a News Limited publication, and I know that there's a feeling out there that somehow I work for the evil empire. I mean, my boss gave me 3 years to try to find a small boy. And he didn't care how long it took and what I had to do and where I had to go or what expenses I had to run up to do it. He said, if that's your passion, if that's what you want to do, you go and do it. And that's the kind of company I work for, that I'm proud to work for. The problem for me was becoming very, very close to people who were hurting in an unbelievable way. Now, I mean, if all of you in the room who have children or who have cared for children will have lost them at one point. You turn around and suddenly they're not there. And you might be in a supermarket or on a beach or somewhere, and you know that feeling of that cold dread that runs in you, and you know that you would never recover. You will never recover. Well, there are 4 people at least in Sydney who feel that every single day. And not only do they feel it every day, they're raw. When you look at them, they are raw with grief and anger and disbelief and sorrow at what has happened to them. Their lives are destroyed. I can't even describe to you the ways in which their lives are destroyed. They can't function in a normal way, the way you couldn't if something happened to your child and nobody could tell you where they were. And your imagination takes you to places you don't want to go. You wake up in the night screaming because you think, what if he's alive? How is he living? What is being done to him? You just need to know. And so when you're the person that is in good daily contact with the people who are suffering like this, your sense of anxiety about it is meaningless and unimportant. The main thing is to try to honour what they are going through and find them some answers, because it's so frustrating to me that we can have a case like this that is unsolved, and that you can have New South Wales police officers saying in public forums, no one cares about that kid, send that case to the cold case files. That to me is disgraceful. Michael, I'll go to you now on the ideas and sort of some like real life things that, because I want to come back to you on that as well, Caroline, but some real life things that inspire your writing. And I know, like with the list, you'd spent a lot of time, working over the years investigating.
I mean, that was, a lot of that book really was a reflection of a lot of the conversations that I was having with a lot of those people at that time in the counter-terrorism sphere, and at that there was a particular moment, when all of those conversations were going on, and so in a way, that was. It was easy to tap into that experience because that was what people were talking about. All the people I was talking to, that's what they were talking about. And so I guess that does give it, obviously gives it some sort of authenticity. In this new book, I actually was inspired by a real life crime for one of the crimes in the book, and although it's very different, but it was inspiration. And it was a cold case too, and interesting how, with sort of interesting political dimension and political connections. So it was, for me, that was, inspiration can come from, where does it come from? I don't know, it comes from anywhere. But I mean, you read something, you go, oh, actually, that's really interesting, isn't it? And if that then sends you off on some bigger, brighter course somewhere that ends up turning into a major character or a major event in a book or whatever, that's good. And I mean, I'm sure that, I think as I said before, I mean, our lived experience is reflected in everything we write, really, So certainly in fiction, I think we all bring our personal experience to it. You can't not do that.
What about, has any, in fiction world, any sort of real life characters or people, do they appear in your books?
Oh, for sure. So this one, The Ones You Trust, so the opening scene is the mum goes to the childcare centre to pick up her 2-year-old daughter and she's not there. And so she thinks, did my husband get her? Maybe I forgot my husband got her? Or was it the nanny? Because they've got a nanny, they're both professional people. So was it the nanny? Maybe did I forget? God, so she goes home and she says to her husband, where's, hello? And he's like, what? I thought that's an interesting scenario to play with, because you don't know whether the mum's telling the truth, you don't know whether the dad's telling the truth, you don't know whether the nanny's telling the truth, you don't know whether the staff in the childcare centre are telling the truth. I mean, did they lock up and not look for her? You don't. So there's a range of different things you can explore in the story. And of course we know that that's a real life story. And in fact, I'm sure that I read it as a journalist, if I didn't myself report on it, which may also be possible, that we know of cases where people have gone to childcare centres and found that their children are not there or have been. I think the one I read, actually the child had been left behind. The parents came and the place was all locked up and the kid was in there and they found it delightfully sleeping amongst, a big pile of stuffed toys. One of them was actually a real child. But I did think to myself, it's an interesting scenario. And that sometimes happens to me with, like I was doing a story the other day and I thought, gee, that's a good story for a book. I was researching in the coroner's court, and there was a case of a woman who had disappeared in 1958. So it was Australia's oldest missing persons case, and it has just been solved. In the last month, it was just solved by a private investigator. And I thought, gee, that's a great idea, isn't it? Like the grandchildren, their mother had been so traumatised by the loss of their mother that they decided to hire a PI to find out what had happened. And, the police had it on their books for 62 years, and he solved it in 12 billable hours. 12 billable hours. It was just the most... But, I mean, times are different now. There's more technology, you can do more things. But, yeah, they had it on the books for 62 years.
What happened?
If I told you that, I'll ruin my next book.
Yeah, real-life characters. How about yourselves? Or in reading Trust... Chris, you talked about Martin Scarsden shedding the persona of a foreign correspondent, and he's looking around the walls of his room, and there's memorabilia, if you call that, up there from, I think there's something hanging on the wall from Libya. There's all different things collected from around the world, and I couldn't help thinking, okay, you're a roving correspondent for Dateline. This is the kind of wall that I could see in your house. So to ask you a really unfair question, how much of you is in Martin Scarsden, and how much does that sort of experience help you build his character and other characters?
Part of him is me, in that, like the work practices and knowing how journalism can work and the obsession with a story. But another part of him is more based on people I met. So I was a sort of an itinerant, sort of roaming sort of correspondent. But I wasn't, and everyone for some reason then makes the leap and thinks that I was a war correspondent, which I wasn't. I was more likely, in Tokyo doing a story on the Japanese economy, where the biggest danger was a bit of fugu on the, sushi train sort of thing. But there were times when I did go to conflict zones, and you'd run into these characters who were bona fide, war correspondents. And if they weren't damaged on the way in, they were certainly damaged on the way out. PTSD, self-medicating with booze and drugs and whatever. I decided I wouldn't make Martin a boozer because it would just be too much of a cliche. So he's more that impression. And that, I think, though, one of the things that informs that is just what Carolyn was talking about. So she spent 3 years with William Tyrrell and those people. It affects you. They're affected, but it affects you as well. Journalists who covered, it's not just war, but, natural disasters, it can mess you up. And so that was one of the things that I wanted to do in the books, is to have, if there was violence or whatever, that it actually affected people. You get those sort of typically American thrillers, and there's 12 people have just been shot dead, and the reaction is, a couple of glib throwaway lines. I think it is important to reflect on journalists, and it's not only journalists, but internationally, aid workers in particular. Here in Australia, first responders, the police, the ambulance, whatever, that actually does have a real life sort of impact on people. So not so much based on me, Tim, but probably based on the experiences that many journalists go through.
Brisso, and you may both also have some views on this as well, but writing cops and journos aren't too different, really, are they? And how do you find when you're writing a cop character?
Well, they are and they aren't. I mean, the interesting thing about journalism is that it gives you license to ask questions of anyone at any time and go anywhere, and we do, and police obviously do the same. So, and we're often at the same things. We're often covering, we're arriving at the same time to things sometimes. We're seeing the same things, and to Chris's point about first responders and the sorts of things that that police have to see all the time. I mean, man, just like imagine being a highway cop or something like that. That would just be just incredible. So we have this weird. We do have a weird sort of relationship where we feed off each other too, and and if you've ever done police rounds, you've got to get close to them, and you've got to be, I'm not sure what it's like now, but certainly in the 80s and the 90s, the pubs around here, there were some pubs that were just full of cops and journos.
And crims.
And crims, exactly. All sort of circulating around the same bar. I mean, the Cauliflower Hotel down in Botany, on Botany Road, was notorious. I mean, it was just so. There was a lot of sort of mixing going on as well. I'm not sure that happens that much anymore. I think it's sort of a different experience now. But yeah, I think that's why for us writing these books, we sort of understand the license that's needed to get to the nub of a problem, right? And that's why writing police, I think we sort of understand it. Although it's fascinating because this latest book I did. The first book wasn't really about police so much, but there's a lot of police action in this one. And I got some detectives to read one of the first drafts, And this guy who's retired, he comes back and he says, he was so great, he was so helpful, and he just said, well, this is what Crime Command looks like. This is the way you got to write it, right? And that's great, because we sort of know what they do, but we don't actually, we don't spend time, with the whiteboard, or, cleaning up the desk from some other detective who's left his coffee cup all over it, and that sort of stuff. So, yeah.
I remember researching the book that I was doing. Now I sat down with this tactical operations cop, and I was asking him about how they're working with the different police when they're doing a raid or something. He goes, "Oh no, little dog, don't come to that fight." So it's the big dog. The big dog's in the fight. We don't bring the little dog. You don't work together. It's just all the way they speak as well. It's just sort of capturing that well.
And one of the in this new book, one of the opening scenes is this politician gets shot down at Brighton Le Sands, and I wrote this scene and I gave it to the copper, and he said, "You know what? If a politician was shot in Brighton Le Sands, this is what would happen, right?" So it was great. Like he just said, fucking deputy commissioner would be there. Like this is how you got to take this really seriously because that's what would happen.
Yeah. Caroline, do you want to say something then?
Yeah, I would say I know that with William Tyrrell a narrative took hold that the police really messed it up. And I didn't see any point really. I always like to start from the position that everyone is trying their best and everyone is doing their best. And did the police want to find William Tyrrell? You bet they did. They absolutely did. And did everybody who turned up on the first day and searched for him they thought he was lost. And so they went and they looked in dams and they looked in drains and they looked up trees and they asked people to look in caravans. And they did that because they hoped that they would be able to catch him in their arms and run to the parents and say, look, I've got him, he's here, he's fine. And that was not the case. He was abducted. And so as a result, a lot of forensics was lost because people were running all over the place. And so people want to criticise the cops. And I think, well, okay, maybe we'll do it next time differently, but what would be the point really of just bashing somebody in print for being good-hearted and full of goodwill at the time? Most of the cops that I come across are tremendous people, really dedicated, and two in particular stick in my mind. One of them is the woman who was, some of you will remember a crime where a girl in North Sydney was approached by someone who put a bomb around her neck, told her, the collar bomber, do you remember that? It wasn't really a bomb, but he told her it was a bomb. And he put it around her neck and he made her sit there. A police officer sat with that girl for nearly 20 hours and they didn't know whether that was a bomb or not around her neck. And she said to her, I will never leave you. And that to me, can you imagine? She didn't know whether that was a bomb or not. Could have blown them to pieces. She said to a teenage girl who was frightened, I will not leave you. I thought that was incredible. And the other one that really stuck with me for a long time was a police diver, the first woman to be a police diver in Victoria, who dove into the dam where Robert Farquharson drowned his children. And I watched her, she was giving her evidence. She said that it was very murky, the water was very murky. The car, when it went into the dam, landed nose down. So you can imagine that, nose down. So when she went into the water, it was very murky. You couldn't see anything at all, a lot of debris in the water. So she had to kind of reach out and feel like this. She found the underside of the car, like that. She realised it was the underside of the car. So she kind of went to the side and she turned. Okay, so that's the wheel. And then she went around to the side of the car and she found the car door was open. She felt inside, a head. She felt immediately it was a small boy's head. She came out of the car, she stood on the bank and she immediately asked for a notebook and started to take everything down. Which door was open, the fact that the lights on the car were on, which was important, where the position of the bodies inside the car were, because she knew in that instant that there would be a trial. And she wanted to be 100% sure that all of her evidence would be completely accurate as to whether the engine was on, the lights were on, the doors were open, because all of that would matter if this was murder. And I thought to myself, what an incredible professional in those circumstances to have just discovered that, to have held in your hand the head of a small drowned boy and to have the foresight to come out and take it all down as quickly as you could so you didn't lose an instant of it and you couldn't be criticised on the stand. And I remember holding the notebook in the courtroom, all the paper all crisp from her wet hands, and I just thought, these people are magic. They're magic.
In reading The Ones You Trust, it was difficult for me because I...
Left your child in childcare centre?
No, I didn't do that. No, I worked in morning television.
Oh, I see.
And so years ago, setting up ABC News Breakfast and running that show for a while, in reading it and all of the... I mean, I work with some wonderful people in morning television, I should say, but I'm
Where
aware
did you work?
of the...
Let's hear the dirt.
No, News Breakfast, ABC. So, but just, knowing, and also actually I had a bit of experience working at Channel 7 on Sunrise many years ago as well. So the whole...
You don't look old enough.
The whole...
Have all these experiences.
I'm 41. So, anyway.
Baby.
But those kind of rich characters, because you're telling the story also of the kind of the twisted side of journalism in that book as well.
Sure, there's a twisted side to journalism there, and part of it is ratings and commercially driven, because we are all in journalism, with the exception of our friends at the ABC, having to make a living. Everybody's got to sell ads, and they've got to get clicks, and they've got to get readers, and they have to sell subscriptions to newspapers. And unfortunately, sometimes that means that stories are going to be sensationalised. It's a disappointing trend, I think, that we've seen in the last 10 years, but it's also probably a reality of the fact that people have to pay. And so, I don't know. What are your thoughts on it, Michael?
On what specifically?
Well, I mean that idea that we live in a marketplace where you have the ABC,
Sure. I mean, look,
and
there's
SBS too.
definitely,
I guess
definitely, ABC is in a, we are in a privileged position in that sense. There's no doubt about it. I mean, which is why you can have things like Four Corners and whatever continuing to do this work over all this time, because not every time you do it, you don't do these stories and they're not always ratings winners. They don't have to be, like that's not
which is
really
great,
important.
which is fantastic.
Which is we have decided as a society that that's a very important function for the public, to have a public broadcaster that can do that stuff precisely because of the things you're talking about, right?
Sorry, Chris.
Yeah, I think one of the lessons from the US elections is what happens if you don't have a national broadcaster, if you don't have an established base of facts, and if you have media that doesn't have to make a profit because it's being cross-subsidised by somewhere else in the organisation, that's another trap. It's something, bringing it back to the fiction side, that I try and put in a bit with say, Martin. It makes his character, one of the things when I started writing the books was I didn't want all the baddies to be like really bad and all the goodies just to be as pure as the driven snow, because no one's like that. Everyone's kind of complex, right? And one of the things with Martin, he gets stories wrong, which, there's this sort of myth that every news organisation will promote. It's the one thing that every news organisation wants, and that's that sense of being authoritative and accurate. But of course, in the hurly-burly, people do get stories wrong. And journalists do take shortcuts. Doesn't necessarily mean that they've been given the authority to do that by their editors. It might be more of turning a blind eye, but they will take, let's say, ethical shortcuts. I mean, there have been plenty of cases where they've just broken the law, or, there's been some famous cases in the US of just making stories up. People winning Pulitzer Prizes, and then a year or two down the track, oops, it's it was fiction. At least our books have got fiction, stamped on the cover.
They're not fiction shelves.
They're not pretending. But, and this is one thing that we can do in fiction, is to get to some of those truths. So my protagonist is a journalist, but, and Tim as well, right? And but even if you have police or whatever, you can touch on those areas where all those institutions are flawed, whether it's the police, whether it's the journalists, whatever.
Yeah. Look, we're getting to the part of the show where we'll get some questions from you guys in the audience, but I'd also call out to those watching us on the stream online. Thanks for joining. There's not. I was told. Is it going to be replayed later? Right. Right. Okay.
We're off Broadway, mate.
Don't worry about it. And luckily, this is not going to be shown anywhere to embarrass me for that
This
moment.
is exclusive.
Anyway, okay, yeah, this is exclusive. Good club. So anyway, I do want to get some questions from the audience, though. So if you have one, please speak loudly. For the audio recording, I'm going to repeat the question for you guys. But would anyone like to kick off? So just for the audio recording, I'll just say in summary, the questions around Donald Trump getting up yesterday and basically telling a lot of lies in his speech around vote rigging, and some US networks deciding to pull out of that and say we're not going to show our audience that. Chris, you're going to say something.
Let me have first crack, as I don't have to answer to any editors or anything. They would have thought that through beforehand, that what happens if he does this, because he kind of telegraphed it. It's a very really hard decision to make. The fact that so many of them did it so quickly indicates, and they'd all be watching each other too. And I think it's a result of 4 years of of reporting stuff, at first our job is simply to report, and then after a while going, no, hang on. And I think the deciding factor there, the easy option would be to say, no, we'll broadcast it, we'll let the viewers make up their own mind. I think in the back of the head was, this is inflammatory. This could cause violence, looting, riots, death. No, let's stop it here. So my own opinion is difficult decision, but a really responsible one.
But also, isn't it interesting that they had the courage to do it now, right? Because
they think he's going to lose.
Yeah, that's right, because he's going to lose. So they go, okay, he's going to lose, all bets are off. We're pulling out of this, we're not going to stand for this anymore. But they didn't have the courage to do it a year ago.
I would have loved to hear the conversation between Jared Kushner and Rupert Murdoch.
Yeah. So we've got about 6 minutes left, I think. On that Rupert Murdoch phone call would have been hilarious. Interesting. I remember one of the big US network bosses, during the campaign in 2016 saying Donald Trump may not be good for America, but he's great for our bottom line. And back then it was this kind of unfettered, he's bringing us ratings, put him on. And Twitter did the same. Everyone was doing the same thing. This sort of, and the whole idea of, our job as journalists, it made so much harder because everything's live everywhere. Often, in the past, we're able to slow things down. And I actually think now, from the decision that you've cited, we've just talked about, I reckon we're going to see a lot more of slowing things down now and not giving platforms, not just to Trump, but to others as well. And that probably goes for, I run ABC News channel, for Australian politicians as well. You will not get up and just get in the microphone for as long as you like. It's not going to happen anymore.
But, Tim, this is one of the things, I think this is really interesting because one of the criticisms of 24-hour news is that they just, someone stands up and talks and you don't cut away from it. So you'll have someone like, Barnaby Joyce will get up and talk for 15 minutes on some, complete sort of wander off the reservation on some complete sort of, weirdness, and you'll still be on it. Yeah. Now, so it's interesting that
it's really hard during election campaigns. Much harder to juggle that.
Sure.
But now we are having, and as Chris rightly pointed out, they would have had that discussion earlier, and we're having that. And we've kind of gone off topic here a little bit, but we're having that discussion, and we, literally, it is. What's the point of this person standing up? Is it newsworthy? If it's not, let's listen to the questions and then decide if we're going to broadcast the question and answer part of this announcement, if it's indeed an announcement at all. Other questions? I will go to Caroline.
Well, my first advice to you is keep going. I've
just got to record the question. It's how you research. Do you research first and then do you write, or does it get interrupted halfway through?
So, Last Woman Hanged was a book that I did, which is a historical study of a woman who was hanged here in New South Wales in 1889 for the crime of murder. Very likely that she did not commit it. She went to 4 trials. They tried her 4 times. 3 times the jury was unable to reach a verdict. By the 4th trial, the jury finally got the message that they wanted a conviction and they gave one. But there was a lot of, it was entirely circumstantial evidence. And a lot of the research was done right here at the State Library, of course. It took 5 years to write that book, and also out at Public Records, where I'm sure you've been if you're researching. Take a jumper is my advice, because the records are so old. I mean, you can go into the box that covers the hanging of Louisa Collins, and the documents are, the piece of paper in which she was admitted to prison just down the road here in Darlinghurst, and they're old. And so they keep the documents at a very, very cold temperature so they don't disintegrate. When you're reading Louisa's letters to her daughter, I mean, her actual handwriting, it's an extraordinary experience, and I encourage you to keep going, because it's wonderful for your mind to take a step back a century or however far you're going and try to imagine how people lived. I never, ever gave up the process of still looking. If I had a question, I started to wonder what happened to the hangman after the execution. I mean, that must have played on his mind. She was a woman and a mother of 7, and there was so much doubt about her guilt. I mean, and so I went and looked what happened to him, and he became a chronic alcoholic, and he was ostracised in the community. He lived in Bondi, and he had to send his horse to the pub, and they used to put the beer in a little sort of panhandle on the side of the horse and send it back to his house.
Is he the bloke who was missing a nose?
Yeah, he had no nose, because his nose had been kicked off. And he turned up at someone's house for dinner once, and they didn't know he was the hangman. And then after he left, the lady of the house was told that was Nosy Bob, the hangman, and she threw out all the cutlery because, he was there. People had superstitions about him. Those kinds of things, if you've got the chance to dig them out, I reckon keep going. And even if you end up not writing the book, it's definitely worth doing.
I reckon we've got time for one more.
Well, I just think you have a lot more space.
I've just got to do the questions. So we're not on the stream, but we are being audio. So the question is around, the freedom to probably be more negative and, unshackled in talking. Specifically, it was about the police, but that may
it's a very
talk about other
question.
things
It's a very
as
clever
well
question.
when you're writing fiction.
Look, I think that is true, but I think you have a lot more space. As I think one of us said before, when you're writing, 100,000 words as opposed to 2,000 words. And you're developing character, and your dialogue and all of that sort of stuff comes into play. And again, your lived experience is important in a lot of that, because that's how you talk to them. That's how they talk to you. That's how those relationships work, and it's not always good. And when you've got a lot of space and you're developing characters, and you've got, of course, you have an enormous amount of freedom, and that's one of the great things. That's one of the things I find most satisfying about writing fiction is the ability to actually expand this, dialogue, for want of a better word. The whole experience, which you don't have in 1,500 words, or even in you'd never do it in 40 minutes of television. But it's
Bristow and I both spent a lot of time over the years in the Canberra Press Gallery. So it's a different relationship there because unlike the police who are kind of behind the scenes, the politicians are public figures, but you're dealing with them all the time and you're going to them, you're having off-the-record conversations, whatever. But then if they do something wrong, even if you've got a good relationship or something, you've got to criticise them. The thing there, though, which is interesting, it's quite a professional type of attitude that most of them are going to have, and that is if your criticism is fair, they won't come back at you. It's only if it's unfair or if you've got the story wrong. Although occasionally, you can read your colleagues and competitors' copy, and over time you can work out who their sources are.
exactly.
And you can see sometimes when everyone's, someone's done something really obviously wrong and everyone's piling on and you sort of go, oh, but hang on a moment. So it can be at times a rather subtle dance, yes.
Well, that's all we have time for. Thanks for your questions. Thanks so much for coming along.
Thank you to the moderator.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Well, thanks to Chris Hammer, Michael Brissenden, Caroline Overington. All the books up there of theirs, I've read them. They are fantastic, and I'd urge you to join them outside. There's going to be some signing and selling of books after this, and the list will be a preview to Dead Letters, which lands in February.
Great title, Dead Letters. Really good.
Yes,
yeah, good.
It's a good book.
Did you come up with that?
I did.
Publisher, you did.
Well, actually, I wanted to call it.
You don't always get to name your own books. That's the secret of publishing.
I came up with it was actually originally called Bird Letters, and
Bird Letters.
Yeah, and.
No, Dead Letters is better.
Anyway,
just saying.
we workshopped it into Dead Letters, which I think is better. Yeah.
Thanks very much. So we could also make a pretty tidy exit due to the